Welcome everyone to today's Ethnic Media Services weekly Friday news briefing. I'm Sandy Close, EMS Director. Today our focus is on what has become the fastest growing and largest refugee situation in Europe since World War II. More than 2 million Ukrainians have left their country in the last 2 weeks, and refugees may top 4 million, maybe even more. This crisis adds to the record numbers of people, 84 million, who have been forcibly displaced worldwide. Today, experts will examine the immediate impact of this new crisis and who will be affected, including other immigrants and refugees still waiting in long lines and with very long backlogs.
We can hear your papers move, Sandy.
Oh, thank you. Sorry about that. The speaker lineup has a last-minute change due to issues beyond the panelists' control. Instead of Megan Benton, we will have Natalia Banulasu Bogdan. I'm so sorry to mangle that. Associate Director of Migration Policy Institute's International Program. That's Natalia Bogdan for short. Our colleague journalist Manuel Ortiz, who is now inside Ukraine and has been reporting at the Polish border. He will give us a firsthand account of what he's seeing and answer questions. And Krish Omara Vignarasha, President and CEO of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services. Thank you, all three of you. Reporters, please enter your questions in the chat for the speakers. And speakers, remember to speak slowly, as I'm doing for our interpreters in Spanish, Korean, and Mandarin. We are live streaming today's conference and will send a video to all participants this afternoon, along with bios of our speakers. And now, let me turn the conference over to veteran journalist and author, Pilar Marrero, our moderator. Pilar, take it away.
Thank you so much, Sandy. Thank you everyone for being here. This is such an important topic. And thank you to our speakers. We really want to hear from each of you. And I'm gonna first start with Natalia Banulescu Bogdan from the Migration Policy Institute. Natalia, can you give us a global view of what's going on in Ukraine and what is likely to be the impact of this refugee crisis and how it fits with the rest of the world's crisis?
Sure. Thank you, Pilar, and thank you for having me. I thought I would just touch upon kind of three buckets of issues. So first, just an overview of what we're seeing, how many have left, where people are going, and what their legal status is. To talk a little bit about the medium to long-term integration implications and needs. And then just a few notes on the longer term implications for global protection writ large. So first, just some brief statistics. So as of this morning, as I'm sure you all have seen, UNHCR estimates that over 2.5 million Ukrainians have fled the country. 60% have gone to Poland. So that's 1.5 million people in the past 2 weeks. There is, of course, a large Ukrainian diaspora in Poland, and other EU countries host significant Ukrainian populations already as well. Many Ukrainians left for the EU when Russia seized Crimea in 2014. So it's important to note that Ukrainians were already one of the largest sources of labor migrants in the EU prior to this conflict. So if you look at 2020 data, 55% of the total residence permits awarded to non-EU nationals went to Ukrainians, mostly who went to Poland. Ukrainians were also one of the largest sources of international students in the EU. So just, as we're putting in context where people might be choosing to go and where they already have family ties or previous work experiences. From what we're seeing right now, the flows across the borders are mostly women and children, male Ukrainian citizens aged 18 to 60 are not being let out of the country. So this really distinguishes this cross-border flow from other displacement crises that we've seen in the past, where a common pattern is to see single men traveling first. So this will have implications for the kinds of reception and integration needs of this population. It's also important to note, and I'm sure we'll hear more about this from the people on the ground, but the flows are not just in one direction. There are also people crossing into Ukraine to fight. And the flows are not just Ukrainian citizens. So IOM has estimated that there are more than 470,000 foreign nationals in Ukraine. Around 76,000 of them were international students, many from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. And so the situation at the border is mixed. On one hand, we're observing a much easier evacuation compared to other conflicts. It's notable that all neighboring countries maintained open borders. And since 2017, Ukrainians have enjoyed visa-free travel for 90 days with the EU. So this, of course, eases travel across the border, particularly for those with documentation and biometric passports. On the other hand, we're seeing some protection blind spots. There are a lot of concerns around protection for vulnerable groups crossing borders, including unaccompanied children, a large population of Roma. So IOM estimates that as many as 400,000 Roma may have been displaced. Also stateless people who cannot be returned. So many in these three categories will not have documentation. So that's just, as one more consideration as we're thinking about what happens next. There are also concerns about non-Ukrainian nationals, so people who were migrant workers or students in Ukraine who won't qualify for temporary protection in the EU. And just to touch a little bit on the specifics of the legal statuses available. So Ukrainians will now qualify for temporary protection status in the EU for up to 3 years. So this decision was adopted unanimously 1 week ago on March 4th by the European Council. This grants residents access to the labor market and housing, medical assistance, access to education for children. The clock starts on March 4th and it will go for an initial 1-year period and can then be extended in 2 6-month increments for an additional year. At that time, they can make a decision based on whether or not conditions are favorable for safe return about extending it for 1 additional year. So the initial period is 1 year, but it could be extended for up to 3. This is important because it guarantees a baseline of rights across the EU rather than leaving it up to each individual member state to decide for themselves what package of legal status and benefits to offer and for how long. This has actually never been invoked before, including in 2015 and 2016, when Syrians and other refugees that came to Europe enjoyed different sets of rights and benefits depending on the country in which they settled. Now, there are going to be people who are left out of this temporary protection directive. It is available mainly for Ukrainian nationals and their family members who were displaced after February 24th. It also applies to foreign citizens in Ukraine who were beneficiaries of international protection. So any recognized refugees or asylum seekers who were already in Ukraine, or stateless people who are unable to be returned to their country of origin. But other legal migrants, so the students and temporary workers that I mentioned earlier, fall outside of the scope of the EU's temporary protection directive. Now, this doesn't mean that EU member states won't give any rights to those people. They could decide to apply this status more broadly if they wanted to. They just won't be obligated to. However, they've made a decision that these migrants will be admitted into the EU to ensure safe passage back to their country of origin. But this raises big questions around how people will be returned and how we will keep track of these people once they're in the European Union, especially those who don't want to return to their countries of origin. Non-EU countries like Canada, the United States, and Australia have also announced various schemes for Ukrainian citizens. These are can be thought of in two categories. So one, there's a set of policies for Ukrainians who are already in these countries to not be stranded, so to be able to extend their visas more easily. And there are also some new pathways that are being created, including by expanding family reunification and some talk about private sponsorship routes for newly displaced Ukrainians. And I can say more about this if there are questions. And then just a few notes about some of the medium and long-term integration needs. So there are big questions around where people will settle. Because Ukrainians do enjoy visa-free travel for 90 days, they can essentially choose the member state in which they want to avail themselves of the rights provided by the Temporary Protection Directive. People will still need to register for these permits, which is in and of itself a huge logistical challenge. I mean, this won't happen automatically. People will have to go to the right office in the country and cities they find themselves in. And so we also have to be thinking about what kind of information is being provided to people as they cross. And what systems are going to be in place to facilitate this and make sure there aren't huge backlogs. There are big questions also around reception conditions. The sheer speed and scale of this flow is truly unprecedented. And of course, most of the major host countries right now are Central and Eastern European countries with less developed integration capacity. So questions about how to ramp up the initial reception support for displaced Ukrainians and other migrants, especially for those with no clear destination in mind. So I mentioned that there's already a huge Ukrainian diaspora in Europe. The first flows we were seeing were essentially people reuniting with family members who had a clear destination in mind. As the days go on, we're seeing more and more people who are, who don't have family, who will need, accommodation and services from the state. If you look at the reception places that have been pledged by some of these bordering countries, they don't add up to anywhere close to the numbers we're seeing. So we're going to have to be watching out for how quickly countries can kind of ramp up this support. And
I have some questions, Natalia, when you can.
Oh, I'm sorry. Should I pause and?
Yeah, I think we need to close and then get to a question or two.
Sure. Okay. Just to flag that There are going to be implications for the initial solidarity also that we're seeing right now. You know, I think support for displaced populations typically wanes over time, especially as crises wear on. So I think it's fair to say that we are likely to see some generosity fatigue set in with these big numbers and unequal integration and reception capacity. And then just one note about the longer term implications. I think we have to consider that this is a crisis that comes on the heels of other crises, and countries have a finite amount of generosity and funding and ability to sort of pay attention to these types of displacement needs. So I think we should be prepared to see some knock-on effects for support for other refugee crises around the world. Now, Pilar, did you want to choose which questions, or do you want me to?
Yes, I'll do it. So our colleague Vidya sent me a couple of questions privately. She talked about the reports that we all have seen of African students and others being discriminated against at the borders. Were these anecdotes that were, you know, maximized by coverage, or is this something that you've seen as a problem?
Yeah, I have every reason to believe that these media reports were true. I think there was a lot of confusion, especially in early days, and for populations, one that didn't have biometric passports were not getting through as easily. But of course, there was also some racial profiling. There was an expectation of a certain type of flow coming from Ukraine. And, you know, there was definitely some different treatment on the ground for non-Ukrainian nationals who didn't have the right paperwork on them. Officials have said this is not official policy. They also received some backlash for this from the international community. And, you know, some organizations observing on the ground think that has helped ensure more fair treatment for all those crossing.
Rong has a question. Rong, do you want to ask it, or?
Yeah, sure. So I know that some Russians are also fleeing away from their country. Are there any country providing protections to Russians as well?
I think that's a great question. We are seeing right now emergency mechanisms set up mostly for Ukrainian nationals. So the EU's temporary protection directive, as well as some of these other schemes that I mentioned from non-EU countries. Non-Ukrainian nationals who are fleeing conflict zones will likely need to apply separately through the normal asylum process. There aren't any blanket schemes that apply to them right now.
Thank you, Natalia. And stay with us, please, for more questions later. We're going to introduce now our colleague, journalist Manuel Ortiz. Manuel, bienvenido. He is in Ukraine. He left this week, Monday, I think. And he's been in Poland and in Ukraine and talking to a lot of people. So he has a lot of good information. Manuel, welcome. And we welcome your statements. And there's already a bunch of questions for you.
Thank you, Pilar. Thank you, everyone. Very good information, Natalia. I actually don't have some of that information here on the ground. Even it's kind of difficult to get that information. So I really appreciate it. It's very helpful for me. I'm in Lviv. You can see in the map. Lviv is very close to Poland. It's about an hour and a half. Sandy Claus just asked me how easy it was to get Lviv. It's very difficult because, as Natalia already said, there is not only people who is leaving Ukraine, but it's also people entering Ukraine, even to fight or bring in medicines or other stuff. I like to mention that today there were 2 attacks, one in the north, very close to the west for the first time, and kind of close to the Lviv, one in Lutsk at the north, and the other one in Ivano. Ivano is very close to the border with Romania, and the Lutsk with Poland. That, I think that changed the situation here in Lviv, because people consider Lviv a secure, kind of secure place. But this morning we hear the sirens, and it was very tense. The ambience was very tense. People here don't talk too much, just walk very silent. It's there is a lot of people coming from different places. If we can move the slides, please, the next one. This was taken this morning at the train station here in Lviv, in Ukraine. This is the people who is coming from other cities. Some of these people is taking even 30 hours to be here, because they said some of the roads are destroyed or are not safe. So the best way is to take train, especially also because they cannot drive at night. So next one, please. Once the people get there, they go and underground. There is like kind of a bunker where people make a big line and they make lists. So I'm not clear if they decide which border are they going, because as Natalia said, there's not only Poland, 60% of these people is going to Poland, but also a lot of people is going to Romania. So this is the line where people have to stay. They already did maybe 30 hours or many hours on the road, and they have to stay here for hours. It's very, very cold. Next one. Next one, please. After that, the bus take them close to the border, but not right in the border. So they have to walk again. And it's very difficult because as Natalia said, most of the people are women with kids and elders. And they are bringing very heavy stuff, and they have to walk a lot. It's very cold. So this is the border. This photo, it's the border with Poland. Next one, please. This is people waiting the border. This is a common, is what we see over there. Moms with kids, 1, 2, 3, even 4. Next one, please. After that, they get stamped, so they have to make another line, which can take 2 or 3 hours, because each person have to have the stamp, and it's a military checkpoint. Next one, please. As I said, there's elders and a lot of disabled people. Also, a lot of elders are staying. Some because they cannot do this long journey. This morning I talked to a woman whose parents just have to stay because there were no conditions for them to do a very long journey. Next one, please. So we see like this many kids. I haven't seen kids alone. I know there are some, but I only have seen moms with kids. Next one, please. Once they cross the border, and this is, I think, is important to mention, as Natalia said, there is a huge solidarity, and there's a lot of groups of people organized through social media, especially Facebook. There are volunteers bringing food, hot food, which is very important because they're hungry and the weather conditions are extremely difficult. So a Poland guy told me, a musician that plays on the streets, he gets some money playing on the street. He came here, donate food, and he says that before this happened, before the attack, he thought that the Poland's were very, very divided, and at least for now, they are joining to help. And he made clear that it's not the government, because some media are reporting that the government is providing all of this, and everybody on the shelter said no, the government have nothing to do with this. It's all just the people, even not NGOs. There are some NGOs on the border checking because of what already was mentioned about the racial profiling. I actually have a short interview with immigration officers about who is able to go and who has to stay. They said the borders are open for everybody, and I think so now. Just Ukrainians go first, and they have another line. So Ukrainians have to wait about 2 or 3 hours. Non-Ukrainians wait for 5-6 hours, because some of them don't even have a passport, is what they said. Next one. Next one, this is the volunteers. Next one, please. Yeah, this is the same place. This is one of the shelters. There are not many shelters. This is one of them in Poland side. Not many shelters because a lot of people is staying in apartments, in private houses. People is open their houses, even through, there is an Airbnb, which is an app for renting houses, renting floors. Now through Airbnb, a lot of people is donating spaces. So that's why we don't see a lot of shelters in Poland, but that doesn't mean that they're not, the migrants are there. As Natalia said, what could be a problem later is that they are not ready to receive so many people. Of course, there's, for now, this short period, it's a lot of support, but people is coming. I think is what they said. At the beginning, just few people wanted to leave because they didn't believe their city will be attacked. But now most of the people I speak with, they want to leave. Even here in Lviv, was kind of said before. Actually, I have a contact here. I'm supposed to meet someone here. And when I was on my road, she said, I have to leave Lviv because it's not safe anymore. So there's people living, especially with the 2 attacks today. I think the tensions are increasing, and we will see more and more people that at the beginning didn't want to leave. And I'm gonna stop for now. If there's questions, I can.
Gracias. Thank you, Manuel, so much for being here for us, and excellent work. So Araceli had questions. You already sort of answered some of them, but she says, when you talk to people, what do they say? Are they still carrying on their daily life? What are some of the salient conversations you've had with people, with Ukrainians?
You know, even people who is in Poland, moms, they have told me that they wish they are here fighting. So people want to fight for their country. So many people have told me that. Even some moms said, I'm thinking to leave my kids and return. I don't know if they're gonna do that, but they told me that that's one idea. In Ukraine, when you are in Poland, in the border with these people want to talk. It's very easy. It's difficult because of the language. Not a lot of people speak English. I don't speak Poland. Some people speak English. I have to get translators. But in Ukraine, it's very silent. If you even in a massive line, massive concentration, it's silent. People walking silent, just they see each other, but it's impressive. You can feel the tension here. So people don't talk. I just walk around the city. The farmer market was open. I found a restaurant. A lot of businesses are closed. The city is very strange. It's my first time in this city, but there's a lot of military checkpoints that you cannot take photos. But just to go through any of these ones, you can feel the tension because you go through, I don't know how to say, barricadas. Barricadas with like kind of, I don't know how to say that, with tanks and big trucks. Actually, I'm in a building and sometimes it's moving.
It's the same word, barricades.
Barricades, okay. I don't know if it's normal. Sometimes I feel it's moving, but it could be because there's a lot of tanks going around and big trucks. So you can feel it. So there's a tension here. It's not a normal life.
Manuel, a couple of people asked about COVID. We are still sort of in a pandemic and we don't see people, using the mask, which is understandable. I mean, they're fleeing, they're walking hours and hours. So what is that situation like and how's COVID doing in that area?
I have asked about COVID many times about COVID and everybody said that we are not worried about COVID right now. Actually, I was the only one using my mask sometimes. And it's very difficult because as a photographer, we communicate, especially if we don't speak the language, we use the non-verbal communication. But when you're using a mask and nobody is using a mask, is really strange. Nobody is using masks, even in the shelters. So,
Manuel, there's a couple of questions that I think could go together. Orhan is asking about Ukrainian. Are there any Ukrainian journalists in the area reporting the news to Ukrainians? But also Peter was asking earlier, with the information war going on in social media, what are people aware of on the ground? I know most of the censorship is in Russia, but is there that same thing in Ukraine?
No, I think I have asked also that about misinformation and the Russian propaganda. People are aware of the Russian propaganda, they know, but they are thinking just about to leave the country, about if they have to fight, about to bring pets also, to rescue something. Now, this morning, I went through the border with a woman who was already out of Ukraine, but she went back to bring papers for another person. And when I ask about other topics, they say we are not thinking about that right now, but they are aware.
Journalists?
They talk
Ukrainian
about, yes, they are some journalists. Actually, when you are in a military checkpoints, they do not allow us to take photos. And then some journalists came and they start shooting, and I say, why you say no to me? But they said they are Ukrainians.
Shooting their cameras, you mean? It suddenly felt like they were shooting their guns.
I'm sorry. Shooting their cameras, filming. And I kind of complained to the soldiers, and they said, because they have priority. But at the end, some of the photos that I show you are in areas where I do not supposed to take photos, because when you spend 5 hours with the soldiers, at the end, you kind of even have some friendship with them. You start talking and they say, okay.
Great. Last question before we go to our third panelist for now. How's the food situation there where you are? People, are there foods? Is there food in the stores? Are there restaurants? What's going on?
There's a lot of food. There's a lot of food here in Lviv. But what I have here is there is no food on the journey. So people have been many hours without food. So people is getting here starving, or even to the border. And there's not a lot of food in Lviv. The farmer market was open, but I didn't see, when you get to Poland, there's a lot of food you can choose. There's coffee, there is any kind of food because of the volunteers. Here in LB, there's not like that much, but I don't see, what I see is people, as soon as they arrive LB, they make a line and they want to go out. They're not going around the city.
Last question again. Every question seems to be the last. How does this migration, I know you've covered other migration flows or the refugee crisis. How does this compare to other things you've covered in the past?
It's a difficult question because I've been here just few days. Someone asked me that question in the morning, and I'm not sure right now, but I think
Hello, did we lose them? Hello, hello, hello. Looks like we lost Manuel. Okay, so let's.
I just wanted to say that Manuel was going to share some of his photos with our ethnic media colleagues. So if people want to access.
We lost power.
So if people want to email us, I can ask Peninsula 360 and Manuel permission to use photos that he showed today. Just want to put that out there as one of the very great gifts of having Manuel take on this important assignment.
And I just lost Krish. I don't know where she is. Oh, there she is. Sorry.
I haven't gone anywhere.
I was looking at you and suddenly your little square was gone. I don't know why. So welcome. Thank you for waiting so patiently. We really want to hear you. Krish Omara Vignarasha, she's president and CEO of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services. Krish, we want to know your thoughts about the situation, but also from the USA point of view, what is that the US has done? What should the US do? And clearly, this is going to be have a political impact domestically. So if you care to comment about that too, but whatever you want to share with us is welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Of course, thank you so much for having me. So just for context, so Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service is the largest faith-based national nonprofit that kind of works exclusively on immigration issues with refugees, with a number of different immigrant populations here in the US. So as you know, you've heard, obviously Europe, the neighboring nations are very much the front lines of this response. While the majority are in Poland, I think it's also important to note that if you look at a per capita basis, Moldova has also taken actually the highest number of refugees, and particularly as Russian attacks continue and get closer to countries like Moldova, we are also starting to see some migration from Moldova as well. So a host nation could actually become a nation that actually has refugees fleeing from there as well. Now, that isn't to say that the US cannot play a significant role, because I think that we can. Of course, our first response needs to be right now supporting our friends and allies in the region as they are responding to the immediate needs and as the numbers continue to tick up. Obviously, Vice President Harris is in the region. You may have heard from her press conference yesterday that clearly countries like Poland are struggling under more than 1 million in the country. And so I think you've seen from the US an initial investment of $54 million from the State Department, followed by another $53 million announced by President Harris during her trip. The House and Senate just approved a $13.6 billion package for Ukraine, and a little less than half of that will be for economic and humanitarian aid. That's an important start because it will allow for the provision of food, shelter, drinking water, emergency healthcare, for example. But there are a few scenarios for how this refugee crisis could play out that could impact how the US might respond. So in a best case scenario, the Russian invasion would ultimately fail, and many Ukrainians will be able to return to rebuild once it's safe to do so. I only note that because we shouldn't assume that everyone who has left the country would even want to come to the US. There are many cultural, community, and familial ties to neighboring countries. And so that is why, of course, we're seeing those with family in Poland or even, Germany, traveling to those countries. And Europe has been eager to welcome them, granting them the temporary protection makes them eligible for social services, for example. But that kind of program isn't the case here in the US. We have a similar program in what we call temporary protected status, but it is different in the sense that it essentially only allows an individual to enter the country and to have a work authorization, basically an employment authorization document. It doesn't offer the kind of robust support that is available through this newly created EU program, and it's retrospective. And so it is time limited, where if you were in the country, in the US, by March 1st is when you would be considered eligible for that. But in a worst case scenario, where Russia is frustrated by its lack of progress and we see further attacks, obviously, what you heard from Natalia and Manuel is what we are starting to see, which is a significant uptick. And we expect a larger and sustained exodus, perhaps in excess of the UN's projection of 4 million refugees. One EU commissioner put the total at a possible 7 million. So in that case, we might see Europe's capacity and willingness to accommodate refugees wear thin. There's a real risk of backlash, although we expect that is going to be far limited to what we've seen in the past. And that's where it's going to be critical for the US to step in a more robust and direct way. So if and when that comes to pass, the US needs to be ready with a refugee program that is nimble, that is prepared to accommodate much higher numbers. And that capacity, I would say, exists, but it is going to still require some work. And I say that just to give you a little bit of background. The US Refugee Admissions Program, it began in 1980. The President of the United States sets an annual refugee cap each year. Essentially, the president has unilateral control. They do need to consult Congress, but it's really just a constant consultation. They still have the ability to set the number at whatever they see fit. And so, I just want to be clear about the terminology here. The program allows refugees to apply for settlement from a third country, meaning that is different from a person who has come to the US, where they would be an asylum seeker. So individual who's applying for the refugee program has to be outside of the United States. So for example, those seeking safety at the US southern border are technically considered asylum seekers. And so they are not counting towards the annual refugee cap. Historically, the program has accepted about 95,000, but under the Trump administration, that number was significantly cut to about 15,000. The Biden administration has been rebuilding the program, but in their first year, it only resettled a little less than 12,000. Right now, the president has set the number at 125,000, but candidly, it is still a rebuilding effort. So just to give you a sense of where the US is right now, 5 months into the fiscal year, so the fiscal year begins October 1st here in the US, against that 125,000 refugee cap, the US has only resettled 6,500 refugees. So that is a troublingly low number, but what it means is that there is certainly capacity to accept a significant number of refugees into the United States. there is a regional allocation within the 125,000. So right now, 10,000 are allocated to Europe, and then there's sort of another 10,000 that could go anywhere. But this is really, the discretion of the president. And so we would believe that if there is a dire need with the Ukrainian refugees, obviously, this is an opportunity for the U.S. to help lead by example. And I think the other point I'll make is we have rebuilt the infrastructure in part because we resettled 76,000 Afghan allies. The issue, though, is that the international capacity has not been rebuilt as significantly as it needs to be. And so this is where the US government needs to play a role in rehiring refugee officers, making sure that they are what we call riding circuit and conducting the interviews, that we are using more video conferencing capabilities. And I think that through that rebuild, there is an opportunity for the US to play a role here. And then just the last couple of comments I'll make is, the US has, Americans are overwhelmingly in support of welcoming refugees fleeing Ukraine. And so to Pilar's question on some of the politics, while we have seen stronger resistance and I think concern of the administration to being viewed as opening up the southern border, we have seen strong support and a more robust willingness to accept refugees when it came to the Afghan situation of resettling, Afghan allies. We think that similar kind of support exists when it comes to refugees fleeing Ukraine. And so just the final comment I'll make is, it is an interesting dynamic that we are starting to see. It is small numbers, but you do have some Ukrainian refugees, individuals who have traveled to Mexico, and they have traveled and tried to cross the southern border. Some of you may have seen a recent example of a mother with her 3 children. She was initially turned back a couple times and then was ultimately allowed in today. And the complication here is that the US government, even under this administration, has applied something called Title 42, which is a public health emergency. We as an organization, along with many other immigration organizations, have called for the end to this Trump era Title 42, but that has not been put in place yet. So I will pause there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Krish. Thank you for that explanation. I guess in my mind, I have a question as to whether this new crisis and how it will play out with other crises and other groups of people that we should be helping, in my view, and I know in your view as well. For example, I was just looking at the TPS designation, temporary protected status for Ukrainians, came immediately. And others have waited years, for this. Will this be a situation where this will limit access to other groups, Burmese, Congolese, Uyghurs, Bhutanese, others? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so as a technical matter, the answer is no, in the sense that there isn't sort of a cap that each TPS population kind of is counted against. That said, as a political matter, we would like to believe that it should not be viewed as zero sum, but we do think that there is a political calculation being made, and there is some concern that going into the midterms, that going into 2024 and the presidential, that the administration is taking into a consideration some of the the political posturing of political adversaries, suggesting that this administration is lax on immigration, that they are adopting an open border policy. Obviously, that is not the case. But you're exactly right. When you see swift action when it came to the Ukrainian TPS, and yet it took quite some time for the Haitian TPS to be granted. And as you said, there are a number of other nationalities that have still not been granted, even though it is crystal clear that these individuals cannot return to their home countries because of danger, a number of different concerns.
I would like Natalia to chime in on that. Is this a serious situation? Afghans feels they have been forgotten, other refugee crises have been going on forever, even Venezuela, my country, took forever. Of course, it was during the Trump administration, we didn't get TPS. Now we have TPS, but Natalia, what's your take?
Sure. I think there are a lot of concerns and thoughts right now about differing treatment for different categories of refugees and displaced people. Looking from the European perspective, people are drawing a lot of parallels to the 2015-2016 crisis, where there wasn't the same kind of blanket status given to Syrian refugees, for example, even though, of course, we saw a surge of solidarity and welcoming in many parts of the EU who did welcome Syrians. The EU could not reach a political compromise about awarding them that temporary protection status and how to achieve solidarity in terms of how they were distributed within the EU. In the US, I think there are also some concerns about welcoming capacity, as there are everywhere where you have a rapid influx of newcomers. There's always the possibility for tensions within communities, especially if the flow of people outpaces the ability of local organizations and institutions and infrastructure to react. So I think, one question I would have is how can we make sure that the backlogs we were already dealing with for adjudicating other kinds of asylum applications, so I'm thinking about the EU right now, and for welcoming other refugee populations, thinking about the US, how can we make sure that this crisis doesn't just get stuck in an existing backlog? We have to think about ways to open up new kinds of capacity and resources.
So, Krish, there's a question here from Khalil that he sent it to me directly. Have you seen any states or governors that have expressed an interest in welcoming Ukrainian refugees?
Yeah, so one example is Governor Wolf in Pennsylvania, who actually, Democratic governor, who presented a proposal, I think it was to provide $2 million that would be used towards welcoming and supporting Ukrainian refugees. There have been a few other governors, most have been Democratic, although this is, I think, a good example of bipartisan support, and you're certainly seeing it around the funding as Congress has considered it. But I think that is a good example. And I think just to juxtapose that along the lines of what Natalia was just mentioning, in 2015, you had 31 governors come out against welcoming Syrian refugees. I do think it is a significant contrast, and I think it's similar to what we have seen in terms of welcoming Afghan, refugees and humanitarian parolees, where we have had 37 governors come out in support of welcoming Afghans, only 2 governors come out against.
It's just, you mentioned Title 42. There's a big push by immigrant rights folks to get rid of it, because it's actually it's making it impossible for people to ask for asylum at the border. This is the directive that was put in by Trump. It was not allowing the regular flows of asylum seekers and others at the border for health reasons. How much longer do you think, and you are politically savvy, how much longer do you think that's going to be on?
I don't see policy changing anytime in the near future. unfortunately. And it's troubling because even when it was issued, public health experts indicated that there was no rationale, there was no public health rationale for its application. And certainly at a time when, you know, mask mandates are no longer the case, and, you know, states, the country are opening up to continue to apply this is you know, anachronistic. It also has allowed for disparate treatment. So, you know, that I think is again worrisome, and it relates to some of the concerns that we have, you know, seen. I know we touched on in terms of the Polish border, the Polish-Ukrainian border, for example.
We're coming up to the hour, so I'll just ask a last question from Nadia. I'm sorry, Natalia. Does MPI have an expectation that Ukrainian refugees will want to go back to their country if the situation is resolved?
Sure. I mean, you know, I don't think that any refugee wants to be displaced from their home. However, what we've seen from previous crises all over the world is that the longer and more prolonged the displacement, the harder it will always be to return home. You start to make connections, you start to put down roots, people will find jobs, people will reunite with family members. You know, the longer this period gets stretched out, it's going to be that much harder for people to even contemplate return, let alone not knowing what conditions they will find in their home country and what resources will be available to help them rebuild. So I think we really have to keep that in mind. We cannot have expectations that suddenly, just as millions of people came, they will simply be able to return.
Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, Krish. Thank you. Manuel lost power. That's why he couldn't come back on, but he's okay. Sandy, would you want to close?
Well, just so grateful to the three speakers for their time. I would have one last question. Krish, I know you have to leave right on the hour, so we'll start with you. Is there a silver lining in these powerful images of displaced people that maybe Americans identify with because it brings images back of World War II? Could this, instead of making us feel, okay, they're like us, we'll support them, could it lead to a more open sympathy towards all refugees? Or am I just being too optimistic? I asked that of both of you.
Yeah, it's a great question, Sandy. And to pick up your comment at the outset about my name, I think it is important to you know, so the O'Mara part of my name comes from my husband, who has a very Irish Catholic name, Colin Patrick O'Mara. And what he would say to you is that being a blondish-haired, blue-eyed gentleman, there is no kind of xenophobia, anti-immigration sentiment he's ever experienced in his lifetime, but his ancestors did. And so I think, you know, there is a hope in my mind that we should remember that, unfortunately, you know, for better or worse, we have gone through these waves of anti-immigration sentiment throughout our history. And then somehow we ultimately adapt our view of who is American, right? And I would like to believe that you look at a name like mine, you look like at a daughter like ours, who is part, you know, Sri Lankan Hindu and part Irish Catholic, and people will understand that that is America and that is our strength. It's not our weakness. Unfortunately, I do think that people are able to silo how they approach different populations. We have seen that, you know, even as recently as the Afghan crisis. But that said, I think this is an important time for us to remember when we created the refugee resettlement system, it was forged in the crucible of the Cold War. And so in some ways, this is exactly the kind of situation that the refugee resettlement system was created to respond to. And so when you have political leaders here in the US targeting refugees in a way that we've rarely seen in terms of the intensity and the vitriol, I think it reminds us of why this kind of system matters, and that its value and necessity it has not gone away. If anything, it highlights how vital and important it is, including to our national security.
Thank you. And Natalia, Bogdan, your thoughts, is there the silver lining here as so many of us are getting educated about what it means to lose your home, to be forced by violence out of your country?
I agree with Krish. I think that support for one refugee population is unfortunately not usually generalizable to displaced people writ large. And I think people do have very personal reasons for supporting certain kinds of immigration and certain kinds of refugee flows. And they have other reasons also for being fearful or anxious about these flows. And both that support and those fears can be centered around things like cultural proximity versus cultural difference, or feelings around newcomers making economic contributions versus fears that there will be competition for jobs or scarce resources. And also, there can be fears around security, personal security or national security, and also just a sense of, that people want order, and a sense that there's somebody in control of these flows. And so, even with flows that are generally seen as sympathetic, so people coming from neighboring countries where there is that cultural or religious proximity, there are plenty of opportunities for these flashpoints and tensions to emerge when people do have to share the same overcrowded infrastructure or finite pool of resources. And so, while I am encouraged by the wonderful examples of solidarity that we have seen in the short term, I think we all have to keep in mind that what happens next hinges upon the policies that are put in place now. The more we can organize how people are integrated with a view to the long term, not just for the next 3 weeks, I think the more we can sort of stave off some of the tensions that are likely to happen. But unfortunately, just as we do see surges of solidarity, we're going to see surges of anxiety and fear about the changes that people are seeing in their societies.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I just got a text message from Manuel that he will send photographs to EMS, and with any one of our colleagues on this call who wants to have access to the photographs, to please let us know, and we'll forward the photos to you. It's an enormously generous gift, and we appreciate being able to visit this topic with experts and a journalist on the ground. It's really been an honor to have you three. Thank you.